We like to tell ourselves there's been peace since 1945, that the horrors of the Second World War shocked humanity into a new era of reason, that we learned our lesson, that diplomacy, mutual prosperity, and a shared commitment to never repeat the sins of the past kept nations from tearing each other apart. We built institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, meant to foster cooperation, to give countries a table where grievances could be aired instead of settled by invasion. We drafted lofty declarations on human rights and celebrated treaties banning the worst weapons we'd ever conceived. And looking back across the decades, it's tempting to see a triumph. After all, there hasn't been a Third World War, at least not yet. Europe, once the crucible of endless conflict, is now more united than at any point in its blood-soaked history. Global trade has exploded, lifting billions out of absolute poverty. By many metrics, this is the most prosperous, interconnected, and statistically, the least violent era in recorded human existence. But scratch the surface, and a more uncomfortable truth emerges. What we've called peace for the past 80 years has largely been the peace of hegemony. It's not the kind of peace that arises naturally when equals agree to coexist. It's the kind imposed, gently at times, brutally at others, by a single superpower whose economic and military might overshadowed all rivals. When we say America became the global hegemon after World War II, what does that actually mean? Hegemony isn't quite the same as an empire with colonies and governors. It's when one nation has such a dominant economic, military, and cultural power that it effectively sets the rules of the international system, shaping how other countries behave without always ruling them directly. This so-called Pax Americana was never the absence of conflict. It was the dominance of one power over all others, made palatable by the promise of shared prosperity, and enforced by the twin pillars of economic leverage and military supremacy. When persuasion failed, there were embargoes, coups, and clandestine operations. And when those proved insufficient, there were airstrikes, invasions, and occupations. So in truth, what we've lived under isn't really a pure peace. It's more like a global system of managed order, one that depended on America's willingness and ability to police the world, to set the rules, and to punish those who broke them. In other words, it wasn't so much peace as it was control. Control dressed up in the language of freedom and democracy, yet underwritten by aircraft carriers and dollar reserves. Control that brought stability, yes, but also bred resentment, dependency, and a fragile kind of calm that could only last so long as the empire itself remained confident, coherent, and unchallenged. But that's where our story begins to turn. Because the peace of hegemony is always a temporary arrangement. Eventually, the costs mount, the contradictions sharpen, and the subjects of empire, or even the empire itself, begin to question whether this kind of peace is truly worth the price. It started almost immediately, even before the war was won. In the summer of 1944, when the Nazi regime still clung to its last vestiges of power, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered in a secluded hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They weren't just planning for victory. They were planning for what came after. A world that, in their view, needed rules to prevent the economic chaos that had fueled fascism in the first place. The Great Depression of the 1930s had shown how devastating uncoordinated economies could be. Currency devaluations, protectionist tariffs, collapsing trade. These all deepened poverty and stoked nationalism, laying fertile ground for Hitler, Mussolini, and Imperial Japan. So at Bretton Woods, the goal was clear: to build an international monetary system that would keep global capitalism stable, predictable, and under control. The solution they devised was audacious. Most major currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. This arrangement effectively made the greenback the world's reserve currency. Nations would hold dollars in their central banks to settle trade imbalances or defend their own currencies. If they needed to, they could even redeem those dollars for American gold, though, as history would later show, that promise had its limits. This new system handed the United States extraordinary financial power. Not only was its currency the linchpin of global commerce, but because the world needed dollars, the U.S. could run trade deficits and print money on a scale no other country could match. To oversee the system, they created two new institutions. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, would monitor exchange rates, offer emergency loans, and push countries toward fiscal discipline. The World Bank would finance reconstruction and, later, development projects across the globe. Both were pitched as tools for global stability. But in practice, they would operate largely under the influence of the United States and its Western allies, promoting economic policies that favored open markets, foreign investment, and debt repayment, all priorities that align neatly with American corporate and strategic interests. Then came the next pillar of the new order, security. In 1949, as the Soviet Union solidified its grip over Eastern Europe and tensions hardened into what we now call the Cold War, the United States led the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Publicly, NATO was a mutual defense pact. An attack on one was an attack on all. It was meant to deter Soviet expansion into Western Europe, to assure countries like France and West Germany that the U.S. would stand by them. But NATO was more than just a shield. It was a harness. By binding Western Europe's security directly to American military power, it effectively ensured that these nations, devastated by war, reliant on Marshall Plan aid, and vulnerable to communist influence, would remain firmly anchored in the U.S.-led economic and political sphere. So, within just a few short years of Hitler's downfall, the architecture of a new world order was in place. A new global monetary system with the dollar at its heart, international institutions that policed economic orthodoxy in Washington's favor, and a military alliance that kept American troops and nuclear umbrella stationed across the continent. With these tools, the United States didn't merely help rebuild the post-war world. It positioned itself as its unquestioned center, the indispensable nation, the ultimate guarantor of both prosperity and security. It was a brilliant system. It stitched together war-torn societies, unleashed a period of explosive economic growth, and contained the ideological rival of the Soviet bloc. But from the very beginning, it was also clear who sat at the head of the table, and who would bear the costs if they ever strayed too far from the rules set in Washington. When World War II finally ground to its exhaustive end in 1945, the map still showed the British Empire draped in imperial red, spanning continents from Africa to Asia to the Caribbean. But this was an illusion, a ghost painted over crumbling walls. Britain emerged from the war victorious, yet utterly spent. Its cities had been bombed, its merchant fleet decimated by U-boats, its treasuries hollowed out by the cost of fighting not just one, but two catastrophic world wars in a single generation. The pound sterling, once the world's reserve currency, was battered and losing credibility. To stave off complete collapse, Britain had to borrow heavily from the United States, most famously through the $3.75 billion loan in 1946 that symbolized the new economic pecking order. Meanwhile, anti-colonial movements surged across the globe. India, the jewel in Britain's imperial crown, gained independence in 1947, unleashing a wave of nationalist aspirations from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. Britain simply lacked the resources and, increasingly, the moral or political will to hold these territories by force. Into this vacuum stepped the United States. Not reluctantly, though American mythology loves to pretend otherwise, but with the clear understanding that the global balance of power had now shifted. Yet, Washington didn't take up the old imperial playbook. There were no formal colonies, no direct rule by viceroys under the Union Jack's replacement, the Stars and Stripes. Instead, the U.S. built an empire of a different design, one of military bases instead of governors' mansions, of bilateral security pacts instead of chartered companies, of dollars and loans instead of direct tribute. Where Britain had drawn red lines across the globe to mark its possessions, America laid down invisible lines of credit, investment, and military obligations. It poured money into rebuilding Western Europe under the Marshall Plan, ensuring those nations would be both prosperous and firmly oriented towards American markets and ideals. It forged alliances, NATO in Europe, CETO in Southeast Asia, a complex web of bilateral agreements with Japan, South Korea, and countless smaller states to tether security needs to American leadership. Raw power was still very much part of this arrangement. Carriers prowled the seas, bombers circled near Soviet airspace, Marines stood ready in Okinawa and countless other forward outposts. But this power was often exercised under the euphemisms of collective defense, security cooperation, or freedom of navigation. And perhaps most critically, the U.S. did not simply extract wealth from subject nations to funnel it back to the metropole as Britain had done with India and its African colonies. Instead, it created a system that depended on global consumption. American factories needed overseas markets. American investors sought stable foreign governments to protect their stakes. And the American public, flush with post-war prosperity, bought everything, from German cars to Japanese electronics, keeping the wheels of global capitalism and American hegemony spinning. By the 1950s, the sun never set on American commitments, investments, or deployments. From air bases in Saudi Arabia to naval stations in the Philippines, from corporate ventures in Latin America to intelligence operations in Iran and Guatemala, the United States was entangled everywhere, not because it sought empire in the old sense, but because the new world order it had constructed required perpetual maintenance. Unlike Britain's twilight years, when the empire strained under the contradictions of costly colonies and nationalistic rebellions, this new American imperium was designed to sustain itself. It thrived on ever-expanding trade, on the recycling of dollars through foreign economies back into U.S. Treasury bonds, on a global appetite for consumer goods and, crucially, on a state of perpetual military readiness that justified colossal defense budgets. In short, the United States didn't merely replace Britain as the dominant power. It innovated empire for the modern age, forging a system so deeply embedded in global finance, security, and culture that it often didn't look like an empire at all. But the powerful relationships, the dependencies, and the leverage were unmistakable. And just like the empires that came before, it would carry within it the seeds of both its astonishing success and its potential unraveling. But here's the thing. The United States didn't just build a global system after the war. It also constructed a domestic economy that couldn't easily exist without that system's expansion and enforcement. It's easy to forget just how transformed America was by World War II. In the space of 4 short years, it went from the depths of the Great Depression to the most powerful industrial juggernaut the world had seen. Idle factories roared back to life, making tanks, ships, bombers, and bullets. Millions of workers poured into industrial cities. Entire new manufacturing hubs sprang up almost overnight, stitching together a vast network of suppliers, contractors, and laborers, all dependent on military production. By 1945, the U.S. was producing nearly half of all manufactured goods on Earth, a staggering level of output that no other nation could match. But when the war ended, these colossal assembly lines couldn't simply be dismantled or pivoted to peacetime consumer goods at the same scale. You couldn't just retool a plant designed to forge bomber fuselages to start spitting out refrigerators without enormous costs and delays, or without shedding hundreds of thousands of specialized jobs. And beyond the nuts and bolts of industry, there was a subtler psychological truth. After 15 years of economic pain, capped by a total war mobilization, Americans had come to see large-scale government spending on defense not just as normal, but as vital to continued prosperity. So even as soldiers came home and the parades ended, the logic of wartime economics never really went away. If anything, it solidified. Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union provided the perfect rationale to keep the assembly lines humming and the defense contracts flowing. When President Dwight Eisenhower, a five-star general and Supreme Allied Commander turned statesman, gave his farewell address in 1961, he issued a stark warning. He cautioned against the growing power of what he called the military-industrial complex, a triangle of interests formed by arms manufacturers, the Pentagon bureaucracy, and a Congress eager to bring defense dollars to local districts. But by then, it was already too late. What Eisenhower saw as a temporary arrangement born of wartime necessity had become an American way of life. Massive defense budgets were not an aberration to be wound down once the danger passed. They were baked into the very structure of the economy. Millions of jobs depended on them. Machinists in Ohio making tank parts, engineers in California designing missile systems, small subcontractors scattered across the country fabricating circuit boards or hydraulic valves for fighter jets. Entire regions were tied to this lifeline. Places like Southern California, which boomed thanks to aircraft production, or the Rust Belt cities that lived and died by defense steel. Political representatives from these districts quickly learned that questioning the need for ever more weapon systems could mean economic ruin for their constituents and electoral defeat for themselves. So the logic hardened into orthodoxy. To maintain prosperity at home, America needed a world order that justified constant vigilance and constant spending. This was why, even after the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. defense budget never truly cratered. New threats were always found: rogue states, terrorists, cyber attacks. There was always some looming menace on the horizon to keep the appropriations flowing. And underneath it all sat a self-reinforcing truth. The empire abroad wasn't just about strategic dominance or ideological crusades. It was about sustaining a domestic economy that had been fundamentally reshaped by decades of military primacy. Peace, if it ever truly arrived, threatened to become an economic catastrophe, which meant the quest for security, or the specter of insecurity, had to continue indefinitely. That's why Vietnam happened, and Iraq, and Afghanistan. These weren't isolated blunders or tragic deviations from an otherwise peaceful path, though each was certainly full of tactical miscalculations, misread intentions, and human folly. They were, in a far more unsettling sense, the logical outgrowth of a system that had fused America's domestic economic health with an expansive interventionist security posture, a system that needed threats, real or imagined, to justify budgets and bases, to keep the gears of industry turning, and the electorate fearful enough to accept endless war as the price of safety. Consider Vietnam, a small agrarian country halfway around the world with no real capacity to threaten the American mainland. Yet, through the prism of Cold War ideology, Vietnam's struggle for national unification became an existential test of American resolve. The domino theory held that if Vietnam fell to communism, so too would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and perhaps the entire region, jeopardizing markets, resources, and America's credibility as the guarantor of the free world. What often gets lost is that credibility itself was an economic asset. It underpinned alliances, encouraged investment in U.S.-aligned nations, and maintained the dollar standing as a stable foundation of global finance. So the United States poured in troops and bombs, escalating a conflict that would ultimately kill millions, devastate Southeast Asia, and sow deep domestic divisions at home. Not because Vietnam intrinsically mattered, but because the system required interventions wherever a perceived crack in the edifice appeared. Then came Iraq, twice. In 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the U.S., now the lone superpower after the Soviet Union's collapse, saw not just an aggressive dictator, but a threat to the oil lifelines that undergirded the global economy. Oil, priced in dollars, traded through U.S.-controlled financial channels, secured by the implicit promise of American military might. A decade later, after the shock of 9/11, Iraq became the proving ground of a new doctrine of preemptive war. It was sold to the public under the moral banners of ending tyranny and stopping weapons of mass destruction. But it also sent a stark message to the world. American power would go wherever it pleased, reshaping the political map to ensure energy flows, deter rivals, and demonstrate that no regional challenger could rewrite the rules of the global order. And then there was Afghanistan, a war that began as retaliation, hunting down the perpetrators of 9/11 and their Taliban hosts, but evolved into a 20-year exercise in nation-building, counterinsurgency, and ultimately geopolitical inertia. Even after the original objectives had long since mutated, the war continued. Defense contractors landed lucrative reconstruction and security contracts. Generals rotated through deployments and then into private sector boards. Politicians kept funding it because to do otherwise was to risk appearing weak on terror, undermining the very narrative of indispensable American protection that justified the empire in the first place. Because that's the critical point. These wars were not purely moral crusades gone awry. They were woven into the fabric of a global system that married U.S. prosperity and corporate profit to the maintenance of a security order tilted unmistakably in America's favor. Whenever countries tried to chart their own course, by nationalizing oil fields, aligning with rival blocs like the Soviet Union or China, or simply rejecting the neoliberal economic prescriptions handed down by the IMF and the World Bank, they often found themselves targets. Sometimes it was covert. CIA-backed coups in Iran in 1953 and Chile in 1973, in countless smaller operations from Guatemala to the Congo. Sometimes it was economic warfare, crushing sanctions that immiserated populations and made dissent within the empire a cautionary tale for others. And sometimes it was direct military intervention, cloaked in the language of human rights or democracy promotion. So here we are, nearly 8 decades since the guns of World War II fell silent. And the peace we inherited has never been as simple or as peaceful as our triumphal stories suggest. It was a peace enforced by power, not by universal consent or mutual trust. Treaties weren't just diplomatic niceties. They were often instruments to secure markets for American goods, to lock allies into security agreements that doubled its economic guarantees. The dollar wasn't merely a neutral medium of exchange. It was the bedrock of a system that let the United States effectively set the terms of global commerce, impose sanctions at will, and sustain deficits without the usual penalties that other nations face. And then there were the bases, hundreds of them, scattered across more than 70 countries, ringing the globe in concentric circles of logistics hubs, airstrips, naval facilities, and rapid deployment forces. Each one a silent reminder that America's influence didn't stop at her shores. It radiated outward, backed by the promise of protection for friends and the threat of intervention for foes. This architecture did deliver extraordinary benefits. It unleashed an era of globalization that knitted continents together with supply chains and shipping lanes, forged a vast interdependence that raised living standards in ways humanity had never seen. Millions were pulled out of abject poverty. The global middle class took shape in places that had once been largely subsistence economies. Diseases were fought across borders. Technologies diffused at lightning speeds. Even former adversaries, Japan, Germany, Italy, were transformed into prosperous democracies, deeply tied to American prosperity and security. Europe, once the cockpit of near constant warfare, found unprecedented peace under a shared umbrella. In many respects, this system worked. It delivered on its promise of stability and rising wealth, at least for vast stretches of the globe. But it also came at profound costs. Costs often obscured by soaring GDP figures and bullish stock markets. Because for all the prosperity this order created, it also sowed the seeds of resentment and backlash. Local industries in the global south were often crushed under the weight of cheap imports or forced into producing raw materials for Western consumption, stunting their ability to diversify. Countries that dared to implement economic policies contrary to Washington's preferences frequently found themselves starved of credit or subjected to punishing capital flight. And the very institutions designed to shepherd development, like the IMF and the World Bank, imposed austerity measures that gutted public services, fueling waves of social unrest. Debt became a trap. Nations borrowed to modernize, only to find themselves perpetually paying interest that outweighed any tangible gains. The political fallout was equally corrosive. To safeguard economic stability, the U.S. and its allies often backed strongmen who promised order, from Pinochet in Chile to Mubarak in Egypt. Democracy was championed in rhetoric, but in practice, many democracies were undermined if they threatened the core economic or strategic interests. This hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed by populations who watched their aspirations crushed under tanks bought with American aid. And these dynamics didn't just wound other nations. They reshaped the United States itself. At home, the empire's logic took root in a sprawling industrial military complex and the politics of fear. Whole regions of the American economy became dependent on defense contracts, surveillance technologies, and the next geopolitical crisis to keep factories humming. Communities that once thrived on making goods for civilian life found themselves making jets, missiles, and drone components instead, their livelihoods tethered to conflict. The constant specter of enemies, communists, terrorists, cyber hackers, rival great powers, wasn't merely a byproduct of global vigilance. It was a structural necessity. Without threats on the horizon, how could policymakers justify trillion-dollar defense budgets or the steady encroachment of security agencies into private life? How could legislators keep funneling money into districts whose economies revolved around Pentagon largesse? In this way, the peace of American hegemony paradoxically depended on the perpetual anticipation of war. It couldn't tolerate a truly tranquil world, because that would undermine the very industries, alliances, and political narratives that sustained it. So yes, this order lifted much of humanity into modernity, but it also left behind a latticework of dependency, distortion, and quiet coercion that has generated deep currents of discontent. The anger that flares in anti-American protests, the skepticism of Western-led institutions, the rise of alternate power blocks seeking to escape the dollar's shadow, all of it traces back to the same architecture that once promised everlasting peace. And inside the empire itself, the ordinary American voter often found their prosperity linked to a machine that needed threats to survive, their civil liberties eroded in the name of distant security, their tax dollars funneled into wars whose objectives blurred with each passing year. So when we talk about the peace of 1945, we're not really describing a world that transcended conflict through shared values or enlightened cooperation. What we're describing is a system where the overwhelming preponderance of American economic and military power made outright challenges too costly for most to attempt. It was a peace kept intact not by a universal moral awakening, but by carefully applied force, by the subtle threat of economic exclusion, by the visible presence of carrier strike groups, and by the invisible hand of intelligence agencies and financial leverage. It was a peace underwritten by money. The dollar is the global reserve. American banks as the clearinghouses for world commerce. Wall Street is a magnet drawing in global capital. all of which gave Washington tools to reward obedience and punish defiance without firing a shot. And when money and treaties proved insufficient, it was a peace reinforced by might. Selective interventions, regime changes, covert operations, drone campaigns, all serving to remind the world that the price of challenging this order could be devastating. This kind of peace is fundamentally different from the vision sold in school textbooks or at solemn diplomatic ceremonies. It was not a natural flowering of mutual respect among sovereign equals. It was not the slow evolution towards some Kantian perpetual peace, where reason and law rule over violence. It is, at the bottom, a managed tranquility, a calm maintained by the ever-present possibility of force, by economic systems designed to bind nations into dependency, by political structures that marginalize those who step too far out of line. This doesn't mean the American-led order was uniquely cruel by standards of history. Far from it. In many ways, it was more prosperous, more stable, and more generous than previous imperial systems. It spread unprecedented wealth, technology, and even genuine opportunities for self-determination, at least where these didn't conflict too sharply with core strategic or economic interests. But even so, it remained an order rooted in coercion, an order that relied on the architecture of power, not on a universal embrace of shared principles. And as history teaches us again and again, peace imposed by power alone is always precarious. Because eventually, someone decides the benefits of the system no longer outweigh its constraints. Or they grow strong enough to believe they can carve out their own sphere of influence. Or the empire itself becomes so entangled in its obligations, so weighed down by its contradictions, that it loses the ability to project authority in the same way. Maybe it's a rising rival, building parallel institutions and new alliances that begin to chip away at the old order. Maybe it's an internal fracturing, political paralysis, economic crises, or a populace weary of endless foreign entanglements. Maybe it's both, colliding in a perfect storm. And that's where we find ourselves today. Nearly 80 years on, the architecture of American primacy is under strain. Challenges are mounting from rising powers, from shifting economic currents, from populist backlashes that question the very value of global engagement. The dollar remains dominant, but alternatives nibble at the edges. Alliances still stand, but faith in their unbreakability wavers. And at home, the machinery of the permanent war economy grinds on, even as many citizens grow increasingly skeptical of the costs. So, when we say there's been peace since 1945, what we're really acknowledging is the lifespan of a unique historical arrangement. One that delivered astonishing prosperity, but did so underwritten by selective violence, by economic compulsion, and by the implicit threat that stepping out of line would be met with swift correction. It's a peace built on precarious foundations. And as the balance of power shifts and the old certainties begin to crumble, the next chapter of this story may look far less stable and far more dangerous than the one we've been living in.